And this is really key, actually, for anyone who's considering being living abroad. Is if you get into the beginning, that means you're pretty much, especially if you're an English speaker, you're pretty much going to be speaking English. But if you get into the intermediate, it's just your people are coming from really different backgrounds, and there's much more of a chance that that I'll be speaking, that you'll be speaking the language that you're learning. And also, I was studying at Alias Frances, which was the local school, and not one of the fancy private schools. And oh no, not Alias Frances. It was the local public one, and someone actually lent me his address so I could do that. So I could actually qualify for the cheap version, essentially.
So, without being registered in France, you accessed the public education system. Okay, I got it. Well, if it works, it worked, no? Like, So in total, how
as a grad student, especially.
In total, how many years were you living abroad then? Like you said, like 4 years in Vietnam, but also like how many years?
So pretty much, from 22 until 28. 29. So I guess that's 7. Yeah. So I spent most of my 20s actually bouncing around and in those different countries.
And mainly because of studies, like it was
mainly because of studies, mainly because I was pursuing my PhD. Okay. And so it was mostly because of research.
Did it influence it a little at all what you are doing currently? Like
absolutely. Absolutely. It is absolutely, because I think that what I learned was about adapting. And so I think that there's a particular way of adapting as a minority in the US. And then there is a way of adapting as a foreigner, as an expat. And so, but growing up, I already had this intuitive sense of how to adapt. And yet that was honed even more when I lived abroad. And I think I just noticed things a lot more. I would just notice, for example, in Germany, I've never been a place where the public transportation is always on time. It was just like, how is that possible?
Not anymore.
And that there's, okay. Well, back then, I mean, and also people were very focused on the rules. And so they had that rhyme of no jaywalking. It was something like, some German friends taught me, it was like red man, dead man. You shouldn't cross the street. And so, whereas like in Vietnam, that's very different. People are constantly, there's no sense of traffic laws.
Yeah, I can relate to that. Like I lived 4 years in Germany and now living in Greece. I think Greece is more like Vietnam and Germany. It's very strict in that sense. So yes, I totally relate to the fact of like, but even like you risk really having a fee. Like there is no cars at all and you cross in red. And if by any chance there is a police officer there, they will find you. They will tell you, hey, you crossed in red. And I'm just like, yes, but there's nobody here. So this can happen.
So there's
don't cross in red.
There's this whole range because in Vietnam, for example, I mean, it made me realize when living in Vietnam how litigious the US is. So, for example, the way that you drive in Vietnam, because I drove a moped, it's just focus on what's in front of you. Focus what's in front of you, and you trust the people behind you are focused on what's in front of them. And then if there's an accident, the more expensive vehicle is always responsible for paying. Doesn't matter whose fault it is. So I remember getting into an accident with a school kid who basically cycled right into my moped. But because I had the moped and he had the bicycle, I was responsible.
Okay.
And yet in the US, you think about everything is about laws. Well, did you do this? Did you do this? Mm-hmm. Whereas there it's more about different kinds of logic.
I assume like that's also one of the like questions that I wanted to ask you related to this. It's like, how did you overcome like cultural barriers different between these different countries that you lived in? Like, because I assume there is a lot of things and a lot of learning in very fast pace. Maybe like you need to learn things fast, no? As in countries that are very different.
I think that the first step is actually accepting it is going to be different and there's no right or wrong. Because I actually would see other expats who would constantly complain, oh, I can't believe the way they do things here. It's not the right way to do it. And
Mm.
it's just different. We have to understand the logic. And so I was actually, I'm really proud of the fact that when I was in Vietnam, I had a lot of local friends. I had a lot of Vietnamese friends. And a lot of
Yeah.
other expats didn't have that. They kind of just strictly hung out with the expat community.
Mm.
And I can't say that was always the case. When I was in England, I was really with the international students because what I found was the students at Cambridge, they kind of the English students, I should say, kind of stuck with themselves if
Mm.
they'd gone to undergrad and then went on to grad school at Cambridge. And so it's different in every context. But I think that first is just accepting, hey, I have to adapt, and then practicing curiosity around that. I know uh, for me, time is really I'm very much about punctuality. And growing up, my mom was always late.
Mm.
And it really would bother me. And I got a lot of anxiety. And yet, when I lived in Vietnam, I really understood it more because in Vietnam, they have this time is rubber. And if
Mm.
you go to a wedding, you can expect everyone's going to be late by an hour and a half. And
Oh wow.
and I remember people would constantly cancel on me last minute. And I would get really irritated because it was just, they must know. How is this constantly happening with different people? And then I talked to a Vietnamese friend and he said, oh, yeah, they know. It's just the reason why they waited to the last minute is because they wanted to make it an emergency. Because if they tell you beforehand, then then they're showing they have to make they're making a choice, and the choice is not to be with you. If they wait until
Mm.
the last minute, they had no choice. And so it's just, oh, so they're trying to be respectful. And it was really getting interested about the logic rather than getting annoyed about it.
That's very interesting. It's just like how cultures approach everything, not basic things in life, like meeting a friend for a coffee at the end. Like
Mm-hmm.
there is like a very structural way of, oh, if I have something else or I need to define telling it, or the German way, no, that you lived in Germany also, I suppose you can relate to that, like
Mm-hmm.
so talking to someone, like, can you have a coffee? Oh, yeah, next week Wednesday between 7 and 7:30, and okay. Okay, I will put it
Yes,
in
and
my
it's
calendar.
follow through.
Yeah, of
Right?
course,
It's not
if
just
it's in
being
the calendar,
polite
it's in the
because,
calendar.
yes, because in the US, it could even be, I mean, especially I'd say in the Pacific Northwest, people can say, oh, we should have coffee. But that's kind of a way of ending a conversation.
Yeah,
And so they don't
yeah.
really mean it. So,
Of course, of course. No, no, that's the typical thing. You find someone that you haven't seen in 3 years in the street, no, and you say, we should grab a drink someday. You
mhm,
never talk with that person anymore, no, and that's
mhm,
also like ways of doing. Actually, I also wanted to ask you, because you are now working with leaders of companies, and you work a lot with leadership and how to define leadership. I think you also put curiosity in there, which is also one of the points that we will talk later a little bit more into it. But how did you notice like very different styles of leadership across the countries that you
mhm.
lived in? How did
Yes,
you
I
find this?
so most of the time when I was living abroad, I was in academia. So I'll say put that through that academic lens first of all, and
Mm,
that has its own culture as well. But
yes.
I noticed that in England, the way that academics are is much more quiet. Whereas in the
Okay.
US, there could be a lot more asserting themselves. I have my strong opinions. I'm this public intellectual. And in the US, I remember there was this one professor he was he was later knighted. He was just the kind of the highest, a very well respected professor. And yet the way he would we would be in these pre, seminars, and then he would just ask one simple question at the end. It wasn't show offy. That's what I realized, that there's this difference. That was one. And then in Vietnam, I would say that it's much more about positional power and deference. There's an assumed deference because of age.
Mm,
and because of seniority. And so already in a way, a leader doesn't have to, they earn the respect because of their position already, because the students will already defer to them. And there's all of these, you can't say this, you can say this to someone who is much more senior. Whereas I think in the US, you could have people who are actually much younger, much more junior, but if they've published a lot and they're in the media and they're very vocal, then they could actually be much more, there's almost an element of being a leader also means having to have an entertainer quality to it. And so yes, I would say that those are kind of three how I saw academic leadership in the UK, the US, and in Vietnam. And again, it's not until I go away do I form my opinions of the US, because now I can see it in contrast. I didn't have that sense because it was the water that I swam in, so the air that I breathe.
Makes sense. Maybe entering just a little bit into the second part of the episode, but then we will go out a bit. But I'm curious about, like, do you believe that organizations should benefit or could benefit of integrating other kind of like cultural approaches on leadership into their organizations? If you liked this short video out of the full episode, you can find the link to it around here and in the description below. Of course, if you are also interested in checking out other episodes, please subscribe and like.